Why is Australia once again shelved introducing age verification for porn sites?
And should we pour one out for Microsoft Relic WordPad? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Uniden Australia. Hey there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and commentators to dive into the big stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as usual by Alex Kidman. Now, Alex, everyone's favorite nutball, Elon Musk, has recently declared that he wants to bring voice and video calls to the artist formerly known as Twitter. Alex, is voice and video calling what a dumpster fire like X really needs?
Look, for legal reasons, I think we should state alleged nutball.
Alleged nutball.
We might be
Okay.
defaming nutballs there
True.
after all. But look, I mean, Elon seems to think that X also wants and needs my work history and biometrics as
Ooh.
well. So, the phrase overreach, I think, applies here. No, I don't think it's going to make a big difference, especially when you look at who's actually posting on X these days, because oddly enough, I have very little interest in calling up a bunch of racists and neo-Nazis. Call me crazy if you must.
Without wanting to jump ahead, I think I'd rather trust Pornhub with my details before I trust X. So speaking of people with trust issues, we're joined once again by the other half of the Kidman New World Order. It's Finder Editor-at-Large, Angus Kidman. Gus, do you think we desperately need voice and video calls on X?
I absolutely don't, because I was thinking about this and if you say, just wait for a second, I'm taking an X, it doesn't matter how you interpret that, it just doesn't work out well.
True.
I couldn't take your call. I was busy being X'd. Yeah. No, it's not good, is it?
Again, I think there's a Pornhub tie-in here. So speaking of things that maybe are or aren't appropriate in the modern day and age, Microsoft has decided to retire its relic WordPad, and we'll have a chat about that later. But first, we're talking about porn and age verification. Now, this is something that's been talked about on and off in Australia for a couple of years. We've looked at it from a few different angles, where there was the talk of the Great Firewall of Australia a few years ago. Now there's talk of various ways to getting people to prove that they're actually 18 before they can look at porn. Gus, what's the latest here?
So we've seen an important development on that front, where the E-Safety Commission has come out with a long-awaited report sort of talking about what should we do about this, what would be appropriate controls to stop people getting hold of inappropriate material. And I guess the big takeaway from it is that they've actually said, we're not going to introduce age verification. There've been a lot of expectation this is what was going to happen. In the discussion papers leading up to kind of this announcement, they sort of said, maybe we'll run a trial or something like that. Maybe that's a good idea. But now they've drawn the conclusion that no, actually trying to introduce age verification would potentially create even more problems than it solves. So while they're keen to explore some other technology solutions, they don't want to go down the route. Shouldn't use the phrase the route yet, but anyway, it's going to be that kind of discussion. They don't want to go down the path of saying you will have to prove your age before accessing these sites.
I'm actually impressed that they've just freely admitted, look, the technology isn't ready, when in the past they've looked at other things like that and gone, nah, we're pushing ahead with a half-baked plan.
That is, well done. That's every government policy for the last 20 years, broadly. I think probably a big driving factor in this, although I don't think it was explicitly called out in the announcement, was that we're much more aware now of the risk of using this kind of personal data. But if you have to share that for that, it could be used for other purposes, and nobody wants to be in the middle of another Optus dumpster fire or a Medibank dumpster fire. So I think there's an awareness that, okay, you've got to be very careful about how you would get age verification to happen, because there isn't a clearly established standard. So because there isn't an obvious national way of doing this in Australia, it just doesn't seem like it's going to line up.
Yeah, look, the phrase Pornhub leak just sounds awful on every possible level. But you're right. No wonder if it's not so much a question of the tech not being there as the will. The other issue here, and I think we kind of have to face it up front, is it's really difficult to talk about this without the kind of, but won't somebody think of the children? You're all only obsessed with technology angle. I feel kind of compelled to point out that 2/3 of this discussion are parents, and you don't have to be a parent to be concerned about people of an inappropriate age viewing, material that is appropriate for people who might be older.
Mm.
And yes, the concern is genuine. At the same time, I think, there's a realistic responsibility that remains with parents, with educators, with the broader community to try and, mediate these kinds of things. And I think that it recognizes the need to do that. At the same time, what's been suggested is, okay, we're going to develop an industry code of practice that's going to try and come up with, best case versions of how to do this. That sounds really good. But the two things we know about industry codes of practice are, one, they take forever to develop. Two, they're normally quite watered down, and they don't tend to include much that's compulsory. So I think it's good that that's going to be there, but I do wonder about the impact of that. Like, it leaves the whole issue floating a little bit, I think.
So when we're talking about industry codes of practice, though, are we talking about stuff that's beholden on like an ISP that might be delivering an adult website to me? Or are we talking about that adult website? Because I would not have thought, and I'm far from expert, but I would not have thought that there were that many adult websites actually hosted in Australia. I would have thought they'd be international, at which point you can have all the codes of practice you want, and it's not going to mean a thing.
No, absolutely, and I think this was one of the things they recognise, is that putting something in that says you've got to enforce this if you just put it on Australian creators is not going to be impactful, because it won't hit anyone. And so the likely thing is that you do it at the ISP level. There is a version of this that is active in the UK, and they call this out. They say that the UK has a very similar kind of attitude to Australia, so they sort of want to look towards that. The UK does enforce saying, right, if you try to get to specific sites, you'll have to verify your age. I've seen this myself, because it's what they do if you get a SIM in the UK and you're going straight onto a UK network. And the way they do it is saying, right, you need to share credit card details, because if you've got a credit card, you must be over 18. Obviously, that's hackable if your kids take off with your credit card in the first instance. But that is the approach that's been used there. And I guess what that highlights is they're saying, right, you have to identify a batch of content and then potentially put this mild kind of block in front of it. So it's not the Great Firewall of Australia, but it does put the onus on the ISP to identify, okay, does this require verification in front of it? That, of course, leads to the well-recognized issue that you can inadvertently end up blocking useful, helpful, supportive content that might actually be useful to people, especially to, teenagers who are confronting questions about their sexuality, who are trying to actually get education on this and who don't feel capable of asking about that from their schools or their parents. So it's not necessarily the best solution. And I guess, in a way, the fact they haven't gone for that, which does seem like the kind of, it's the solution we've seen in other markets, suggests a bit of a recognition that, okay, that's maybe not solving enough of the problems to be worthwhile in terms of the problems that they're trying to deal with.
Well, speaking of the UK, I mean, it's probably worth bringing up that recently in the UK, one of the UK supermarkets had to withdraw from sale a series of snacks based around Paw Patrol, because the packaging had a QR code which was slightly malformed, so it didn't point to a child-friendly site, shall we say. So even there, the actual blocking does not necessarily work all that well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. We know that these things are difficult to solve. Now, you can definitely make the case you shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, you should be trying to do something in this area. At the same time, if you look at generally what the E-Safety Commissioner has said in a range of things, there's probably recognition that in terms of harmful content online, porn probably is not as bad as misinformation and election interference and various other things that are going on, and the unwillingness of various platforms like X to do much about it. So I think, there's a real balancing act there. And it will be interesting to see what comes into this proposed code of practice. I'm sure we're going to hear a range of viewpoints reflecting, they need to go much harder, to, we shouldn't do anything at all. But I guess in some ways it does feel like we're just kind of spinning the wheel on it one more time before we actually land on doing something, or definitively saying we're doing nothing.
They've come out and said that they don't think the technology is mature enough. But have they left it at that, or have they actually given us an indication of how this would work? Because as you say, there's two kind of ways to do it. Is one, it works at the hosting level. I'm a porn site. I have to build this into my site when people try and reach me, which the big ones like Pornhub might do, but all the little ones won't. And it's very hard to enforce, because they're all hosted outside of Australian jurisdictions. The second one is that, as you say, you put it at your ISP level, and it's up to my internet provider to see that I'm trying to look at a site like that and go, hang on, you need to prove who you are. I guess the third technically is that you actually put something on the device that I'm using, which is that's the barrier right there that says, hang on, you need to prove who you are. Is there any idea?
That's very big brother.
It is. Well, it is. And that's part of the thing where
No,
at least this is a bit less Big Brother than the whole Great Firewall of China thing,
yeah,
of Australia thing. Like it's much easier to look at this and say, yes, I can see where there's a requirement for this. Although
no.
even then, there's a lot of blur between talking about porn and talking about child exploitation. And while there's some overlap there, they're not the same thing. But people sort of drift from one to the other when trying to explain why we need this.
Yeah, so no, the whole point of having a kind of trying to develop a code of practice is that it hasn't yet mandated what would be in that. I think you've pretty neatly summarized the potential approaches you could take. A big part of it, perhaps a part that doesn't immediately spring to mind, is that a big challenge here is that it's basically cultural in that Australia does not have a kind of obvious mandated form of nationally recognized ID beyond a passport if you've got one of those. That's the only thing that kind of works on a truly national level. And there's a deep resistance to sharing that to someone you don't want to, and with very good reason, because we know the consequences of that. There are markets where you can do this more easily. The one that comes to mind for me is Sweden, which is an interesting place because it's a very libertarian country in most respects. But Sweden's had a national ID system for ages. It's got a national ID app, and basically everyone's perfectly happy to use it. So if the Swedes wanted to implement this kind of thing, they would absolutely tie it to that. And in Australia, you've got a big cultural barrier in that we don't have a thing like this, and you can imagine the amount of noise that would happen. I mean, and this has been going on ever since. Think back, we're all old enough to remember the Australia card furor of the late 80s and early 90s, like well before people actually realized the scale of problems that could occur in a network society. There was a notion of, oh, I don't want to do that. Rolling out tax file numbers in Australia was a really big deal, and still, technically speaking, you don't have to have one. You can elect to be employed and not put your tax file number in. They'll just make you pay the maximum amount of tax in that case. So there's a real cultural barrier there on the other hand. And I think that's the thing that's really hard to overcome in an Australian context.
Let's just link Pornhub to MyGov. What's the problem?
Some of us don't want to be screwed by politicians is the obvious joke there.
And Rule 34 is the other obvious joke there.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned cultural factors, and Adam, I'm wary of treading into this ground because it gets beyond what this podcast is really for. But there's that conflation of things like child exploitation, or indeed exploitation within pornography itself, versus culturally acceptable pornography or consensual pornography for discerning adults and so on. I certainly do not want to make judgment calls on that kind of material, but I think it's not unreasonable to say there probably needs to be controls on the more extreme material, and certainly material which is, illegal or really oversteps those bounds.
Just how do you do it?
Yeah, it is the question of how. Yeah, I think no one ever disputes. And the fact is, it's often said you don't need specific offences here because if this stuff is definedly illegal, then you can pursue that through the regular channels. I mean, maybe where it lands up ultimately, like it is good and probably a bit genuinely surprising to all of us that this has been a measured response to something rather than a knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, we looked at the recommendations, but we're going to do something completely different because it focus grouped well, which I think has been the history of internet censorship in Australia generally. So the fact they've said, look, let's just not dive in with this, but let's keep it an active discussion, that's not a bad place for the discussion to have ended up.
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm reminded of what happened with R18 and video games, where essentially speaking, that whole debate was held up because of some very specific political interests and balance of power issues, more so than a reasoned looking at what the issues were. We seem to have ended up in that latter case here.
Looking at technological solutions and looking at what's been done around the world, it's what France is doing about this problem that I think is the smartest way to approach it and has the most potential. And it ties back to all the stuff we've talked about Optus and Medicare. What we've said before on the show is that Optus doesn't need a copy of my driver's license. It just needs to have seen my driver's license. So what we need is some kind of system where Optus can be told that I've got a driver's license that is legit, and then we give Optus a little tick that says, yes, Adam has a driver's license. They don't have a copy of it, but they've got a secure way of proving that, yes, that is right. Now, what France wants to do is the same kind of thing with porn. So rather than introducing an ID, an account, a thing where I have to log in and it's all tracked, what they want to introduce is a token. So I can prove to this board, whatever this service is, that I'm 18. It generates a token for me, and that token allows me to prove that I am 18. They don't know what I'm going to do with that token. but it's my token. And then I can go to Pornhub and produce that token, and Pornhub goes, okay, we know you're 18. We don't know who you are. This token doesn't tell us anything about who you are except for the fact that you can come in. So therefore, they've got all ticked all the boxes to make sure that I'm 18, but I haven't had to hand over my IDs to anybody. I'm not showing my passport to Pornhub. I'm not creating an ID with all my details with the government. I'm not leaving a paper trail. And that is kind of the future of all kinds of identity, I think.
Yeah. It sounds great. It also sounds like 30 years old because it sounds like PGP. It literally sounds like just doing that again. And so it's not saying it's a bad idea. It's kind of reflecting the gap between when we come up with what the technology sounds like, because genuinely the PGP discussion goes back 30 years, a bit more in fact. And the fact that we're still at the point of going, oh, hey, maybe that's how we should deal with it.
Enjoying the show? That's great. Don't forget to subscribe, which you can do on every podcast platform you've ever heard of. Just search for Vertical Hold or go to our website, verticalhold.com.au, where we've got handy buttons for every single podcast platform. Well, speaking of technologies that are 30 years old or older, Microsoft made some smallish waves this week, but some interesting ones, by announcing that it was not going to continue development of WordPad, the kind of alternative word processor, the bundled word processor, actually, that you've had with Windows for like the past 30 years, and that in a future upgrade to Windows 11, it would actually remove WordPad altogether.
Ooh.
Gus, are you going to be pouring one out for WordPad?
Well, I do remember WordPad was introduced with Windows 95, so I can remember testing that out in the Windows 95 beta and going, oh, this is interesting, because bear in mind, this was in an era when buying a single copy of Microsoft Word genuinely cost you $400. And that was $400 then, not $400 now. So,
and you got it on a whole bunch of floppy disks where we prayed and hoped that disk 8 wasn't corrupt.
I believe the first time I installed Windows 95 off floppies, there were 14 floppies involved. But we're getting distracted by the sexiness of the floppies. God, that's a phrase we should have used in the first half of the show. But, so WordPad has been in there, bundled in for a long time. But at the same time, feels like it's nothing anyone would have actually actively used in a very long time. So I thought, but then I gather, Alex, you have a use case for WordPad. You still have a reason to use it.
So I am the weird freak who uses WordPad on a regular basis for a very specific task, I should say. But I can also actually recognize where people might want or need it generally. So in my case, I review a lot of laptops, and doing that review involves running a whole bunch of benchmark software, which has to be licensed, which has license keys. So I have a single document which just has a whole bunch of license keys, so I can just cut and paste and drop them in there, because they're all these, massively long things that I don't want to sit in there typing out, BXQ42# question mark 397. Oh, wait, no, I'm giving my password away. Stop it, Alex. But I don't want to have to do that, so I have a document. I have that in a folder that I just copy over to each laptop as I test it, and then I've got to open it in something. And if I try and open it just by default in Windows these days, it tries to open it in Word, but of course, Word is not licensed on those machines. So it just says, oh, yeah, actually, you'll need to sign up for a license before you can even look at this thing, let alone copy anything out of it, which is useless, but WordPad will. I use WordPad all the time for that purpose. More broadly, though, if people are buying especially cheap Windows laptops, they're not necessarily going to want to spring for an Office 365 license.
Definitely
and
not.
WordPad does basic word processing. That's what it
does do that. I mean, my side question is, as a purist, and why are you just not keeping that in a text file? But we'll leave that for another time.
That's what I was going to ask. Notepad is still on Windows, right?
Notepad is still on Windows.
For now.
For now.
This is
you
the
mess
warning
with
shot,
Notepad, then you'll have a problem.
Notepad has been upgraded this year and has had a bunch of new features added.
That is actually true.
Unlike WordPad, which has been effectively untouched since for a long when the ribbon rolled out, and again we're talking a while ago now, they added the ribbon into WordPad. They really haven't touched it since. It has stayed there. It has stayed. They've not taken it out, but they have not added any new features to it in a very long time. So yeah, but to your broader point, Alex, yes, they're absolutely for many people don't they don't want to have to pay for Office 365. But I guess the reason why I can't go, oh, it's so traumatic they're getting rid of WordPad, is because there are two clear paths you can take there, which don't involve spending any money. One is that the basic features of Office Online you can use for free. So the many happy Hotmail and Outlook users, who are still a big proportion of your Windows audience, if they just want to do basic kind of stuff, they can do that in their browser. And if you don't want to do it in your browser, if you're living in an environment where you're still like, I need actual docs that are getting saved that I've got backed up locally for whatever reason, if you're in that kind of context, then there are perfectly good alternatives. The most obvious of which, the longest surviving all the many open source alternatives, is LibreOffice, which is still going strong, which still works well. Alex and I have a relative who is a devoted LibreOffice user, uses it regularly and in some depth. So I feel like if you don't have the financial wherewithal, you can still get a very solid alternative that doesn't cost you anything. So while it was nice that WordPad was there, it's very hard for me to make the case that, this is solving a problem that you couldn't deal with much, other than if you're continually need to open a Word doc on a machine, as Alex was. And again, I just think he's going to have to downgrade his habits there and move straight into a text file.
It raises the kind of broader question to me, though. There's part of my head that says, if it's not doing Microsoft harm, maybe leave it in there, because I don't think it's a very big application. But what should be in an operating system?
Well, just to briefly touch on the harm point, the only other big change they made on WordPad a few years ago was that they stopped it being able to read original .doc files, because remember they turned out to be a big security concern. So one of the few changes they made was saying,
Fair,
we're just moving to docx. So I think, you can see where there's a case of going, okay, this thing just represents a vulnerability. But it does, yes, it absolutely raises that question of, okay, where is the boundary between the OS, especially in an era where we're mostly running apps in a browser anyway. So in fact, that doesn't necessarily come up. And I can't even, what's, you gents are both Mac users and I'm not. I mean, is Pages or whatever it was called the Apple equivalent? What's the story there? I have no idea.
So you don't get Pages for free?
Yes,
or maybe
you do.
You
Yeah. No. So it's basically there. They to the best of my knowledge, they certainly don't sell it anymore, because it's their equivalent foundational Office thing.
Yeah.
Was it iLife back in the day?
It was iLife at one point.
Yeah. Numbers and Pages and Keynote, I think it is, because I don't use that one, are all still there and they all still exist. But I mean, we're also talking about things here like, calculator apps and weather widgets and the other stuff, actually, that Microsoft seems to have been very, very keen to push on us for years now. They've sort of wanted the start menu to be a whole lot more than it is. And all the feedback I ever seem to see on adding stuff to the start menu is that Windows users en masse just go, no, we just want it to be this one thing, not everything.
So now, and I've got two words to say to you both: active desktop. But anyway, let's not. Let's not go there. So, I mean, when there's those small utility things, it kind of feels like, sure, why not have them? Like in a lot of cases, you might not use calculator; you'll just type the equation into your browser and let your search engine choice answer it for you. But those little things, and I guess WordPad sat in that interesting thing where it's a bit more than just a utility. I mean, Notepad is a utility. Calculator is a utility. These aren't things that other apps need to call on.
Am I right in remembering that Pages wanted to save documents in some bullshit other format?
Its own default format was strange. Yeah. This is the case with quite a few things. Like, if you live in those universes, you don't necessarily get the most usable format. This goes way back to, when there was competition of word processors, and it's like, for saving stuff in Amy Pro.
But it's the same with LibreOffice, even though the formats it defaults to are open standards, which in theory are better. It does default to ODT files and stuff, because I know that my dad uses it on his computer, and he is involved with Probus, and so they're sending documents and meeting things around, and there's always somebody accidentally saves it in the wrong format and can't read it, and we have to keep resetting the damn thing to save as docx files to make sure everyone else can open them.
It has that preference, but I mean, to be fair, you can have the same problem in Word if you're not careful. Like, I think any modern application leads you down that path. So, I mean, it is, I guess my contention is the word processor just doesn't make sense to me, because most people are going to do it in the browser. They're going to use Google Docs, or they're going to use Office Online. Like, that is how they're going to deal with word processing needs. And unless you are, in fact, a professional writer, the call for using something like Word isn't strong. I still use Word. I'm so used to using it, I know how to use it. I have a bunch of macros set up that I wouldn't be able to run in Google Docs. So, but I recognize that also I am, someone who literally needs to work with words all the time. Most people don't, and they will be perfectly happy to live in a Docs universe or an Office Online universe if it comes to that. So that one, I feel like that's the answer to this question more broadly, is a lot of things that once would have said, hey, that might be handy to get people started. Now it's just like, oh, well, you just sit there. And also, you've got to be mindful of the antitrust thing. You've got to be careful. If you put these things in here, it looks like you're strangling the competition, then you're still likely to incur the wrath of the EU, and then they'll yell at you 4 years later, by which time the markup will have moved on. But it's still theoretically something you have to worry about.
So if Microsoft Office is the dominant Office format, clearly they don't have any kind of monopoly there.
Well, they don't. I mean, they do have a genuine competitive disadvantage in the sense that, like, they really did in the online space. Google did come up to be the competitor. Like, yes, everything else has disappeared, and we can rattle off them. Yeah, we're old enough to remember when there were. Yeah, when Office. I can remember when Office wasn't the dominant thing. When I started as a journalist, it still wasn't actually the dominant thing. It was just about to become the dominant thing, but it hadn't quite got there. So. But the thing is that, like, WordPad, I don't think represented a particular version of that dominance. It was just, okay, here's a handy little thing some of you are going to use. And these days, people just go, nah, I'm not going to need that so much. But, don't touch my solitaire. Like, that's where you're going to get into trouble.
Well, I've just looked it up, and you'll be very happy to know that you can, in fact, still get WordPerfect. So...
WordPerfect. And there were people who'd memorized those very complex keyboard shortcuts, and it was a thing. So.
It was, but obviously WordPad will no longer be a thing, I guess. Okay, so Gus, WordPad is not much longer for this world. Is there another Windows application, as the Windows user amongst us, that you figure, let's get rid of that one, thanks, Microsoft? What should be on the chopping block next?
Oh,
Say Edge.
Look, I understand where that would kind of feel tempting, but no, I feel like Edge continues to have. It went. They had to bring it back, but you know what? Maybe it is time for them to go for the Holy Grail. Goodbye, Microsoft Paint.
No, say it's not so.
When did you last use Microsoft Paint, Adam?
1992.
Everyone has this lovely nostalgic feeling of what it looks like. I said they tried to eliminate and then brought it back in a slimmed down version.
That was the whole Paint 3D thing, wasn't it?
Yes. Paint has been and gone, but if I sit and look on my little Windows menu and go, okay, what's sitting in Windows accessories that I could get rid of? Windows Fax and Scan. Maybe that's.
Oh my!
People do still scan stuff. Yeah, I say maybe Windows Fax and Scan could just become Windows Scan. Maybe we could just recognize that faxing is only necessary if you're running a hospital.
And listeners, if you're keenly sitting by your fax, ready to fax us some kind of complaint, let us know via the usual channels. Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us this week.
Pleasure, as always.
And now, Gus, it's your chance to promote whatever you like. A website, an app, an Agatha Christie book that we all should be reading, as well as where folks can find you on the web and on whatever social media you choose to use these days.
An OnlyFans account.
Yeah, that is the OnlyFans account that no one asked for. Like, that is the exception to Rule 34. That one will not be happening. As I always say, people can find my kind of highly consumer-centric writing at finder.com.au, and my more obscure rants about the worst book that Barbara Carlton ever wrote at anguskidman.show.
And the Agatha Christie novel we should all be reading?
Okay, so if you're just going to read one Agatha Christie novel, then I'd say go ahead and read Five Little Pigs, which is not the obvious one that everyone would pick on, but actually genuinely is still a good read, even after all these many years.
Sounds like it's bringing home the bacon. And as always, you can catch us at the Vertical Hold webpage, on Facebook, on Instagram. You can look up Adam or me on Mastodon, Blue Sky, or Threads, because there's just too many social networks anymore. I suggest we get rid of one of them, and that one can probably be X, because we're still technically there too.
And thanks everyone for dropping by, and don't forget to drop us a line and let us know what you think about what we talked about this week. That was fucking terrible.
Thanks, everyone, for listening in. Don't forget to drop us a line and tell us what you think about the show.
Tell us your thoughts.
What your thoughts about WordPad are, online porn verification, or indeed Agatha Christie novels.
What he said. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Uniden Australia.